The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, do voters care anymore about climate policy? Then Harvard University's Michael Sandel joins us to discuss whether the left has lost its way. That's ahead on The Agenda. We are seeing more extreme weather events around the world. Record high temperatures, flooding, droughts, the wildfires that continue to rage in Los Angeles, snow in Louisiana and Florida. Yet support for climate policies here in Canada seems to be on the wane, at least according to some polls. In the midst of inflation and affordability issues, do we simply no longer care about climate change in this country, especially at the ballot box? Let's consider that with, in Drumheller, Alberta, Monty Solberg, CEO of New West Public Affairs and a former Conservative MP for Medicine Hat. And with us here in studio, Daryl Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, and Jessica Green, Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto and cross-appointed in the School of Environment. And it's good to have you two here in our studios. Monty Solberg, welcome back to our airwaves from Western Canada. I want to put some stats and quotes on the table here just to get our conversation started. On the heels of the fires that continue in Los Angeles, the Copernicus Climate Change Service reported that 2024 was the first calendar year that was 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which was the limit agreed upon in the Paris Climate Agreement. According to Abacus data, concern about climate change has decreased 14 points between 2023 and 24, from 76% to just 62% of Canadians. And according to Daryl's firm, Ipsos poll from earlier this month, climate change or the environment were ranked 9th among the list of priorities for Canadian voters. 9th. Housing, healthcare, economy, inflation, interest rates, immigration, all ranking higher than the environment and or climate change. Okay, Monty Solberg, come on in here. To what extent do you believe that voters in your province, in our province, across the country, no longer care about climate change policy?
Well, I think they do care about climate change policy. It doesn't rank as high right now because some of these other concerns are more pressing. They're more immediate. Climate change is viewed as a bit of a tomorrow problem. That said, when the smoke starts to flood southern Alberta because of fires up north, they take an immediate interest, and they clearly indicate they want something done, and they want policies that are effective. So I don't think it's gone. I think it's sleeping a little bit.
Sleeping a little bit. Jessica, what say you?
I think that's probably right. I think also it depends on when we say climate change, people think about very specific things, but I think as we'll get into, housing is a climate change issue, public transportation is a climate change issue, fuel costs are a climate change issue. So I think if we think about climate change in a more expansive way, that the Canadian public is still really interested in climate change.
Interesting. Daryl, your view?
No, it's really as very much as Monty was saying. It's a case of the urgent pushing out the important, and not just in Canada, on a global basis. I mean, we track at Ipsos, in 30 countries what people care about. Very similar question to the one that you read up front. And climate change is, out of the 18 that we track, is probably 9 or 10 right now. It tends to be a bit higher, interestingly enough, in the developed markets rather than the developing markets. And so what's happened over the space of the last, I'd say, 5 years as a result of a combination of COVID and then basically what the world agreed was a cost of living crisis is that hierarchy of needs that was out there in 2019, which had a sort of a longer timeline in which people were thinking about maybe making the world a better place. That hierarchy got a lot closer. The world got a lot smaller, and it moved down, and we started thinking more about our day-to-day ability to just get by, and some of these other issues got lost. That doesn't mean that they don't care. It's just that the urgent things in their lives have pushed out something that's an important issue.
No, I take your point on that, but Monty, let me follow up with you on and tap into your knowledge as a former member of Parliament. In this respect, we're about to have an election called in the province of Ontario this week, and of course everybody's anticipating a federal election not too far down the road. Is that to say, given what I'm hearing so far, that if you're a politician running for office right now, You kind of just have to say, yes, I believe in climate change, but you really don't have to say anything more than that. Is that the case?
No, I think in some ridings it'll matter. More affluent ridings, in the lower mainland of British Columbia, Toronto, Montreal, et cetera. There will be, I think, in some corners, people concerned enough about some of these things to cast their votes based on it. I do think you need to meet some basic standards.
Darryl, what about you? If you were advising would-be politicians running for office right now, how much would you tell them to feature climate change in their window?
Depends on the party that I'm advising. So if I'm advising the New Democrats and Liberals and Green Party voters, potential progressive voters, increasingly we are talking about progressive voters as opposed to just Liberals, New Democrats, and Green Party voters. Climate change is going to be there, exactly as Monty said. I mean, if you're in a downtown Toronto riding and you're a candidate for one of those parties, probably you should be talking about it.
But if you're running for the Conservatives?
If you're running for the Tories, probably not number one on your hit parade.
How about number 2 or 3 or 4?
Probably the only thing that you would do is pretty much what you're saying right now, is acknowledge it. Say that you've got a plan, as Monty was just saying, but it's not going to dominate the conversation among the coalition of voters that you're going after.
Jessica, you want to see what you looked like 5 years ago?
I guess so.
Well, you're going to anyway. Here's you and Peter Lowen 5 years ago on this program talking about the political price of climate inaction. This was just a few months after Justin Trudeau defeated Andrew Scheer, the leader of the then leader of the Conservative Party. And here's how it rolled out. Sheldon, if you would.
Absolutely, that political price is starting to ratchet up over time. And as it becomes more pronounced, we're going to see more and more sort of demands for climate policy and more pushback against this kind of climate denialism that we've seen in Australia, for example, in the last over the last month.
The last Canadian election was a great example of a case where the climate goes up as one of the most important issues. It's one of the first time I've ever seen it being a top 1 or 2 issue over and over again in voters' minds. And there was differences between the parties in terms of how much emphasis they were putting on it and how credible they were on those issues. You get those two factors, importance and difference between parties, it's going to become a big political issue.
That was then. How about now?
Well, that was before COVID. So a lot of things have changed, obviously, since then. The whole world has changed since then. I mean, I think a lot of the things that have been said before are correct, that it is, Canadians are concerned about education, healthcare, and housing. Those are their top 3. And climate is not maybe labeled as the top thing that they're concerned about, but climate is wrapped up in education, healthcare, and housing. So I do think that it is just, climate change has become pervasive through everything that we think about now in our political world. And so I think it is, it may not be called, it may not be at the top of the list labeled as such, but it's still pervasive and it's still something that Canadians need to be and I think are concerned about.
You will well remember, Monty, that Andrew Scheer kind of took it on the chin in that election because he had pretty much nothing to say about climate change, and the voters expected him to have at least something to say about climate change. Where are we at on that scale today?
Well, Pierre Poilievre has talked about the need to embrace technology. He's talked about the need to engage the provinces who do the lion's share of the lifting when it comes to addressing climate change. The political landscape has shifted as well. So the degree to which you talk about it might have changed somewhat, especially with what's going on in the U.S., especially. But there's no question that the Conservatives have to have a credible message. I think they're getting there, and I think a lot of it will center around things like nukes, carbon capture and storage, critical minerals, this kind of thing, things that align with a conservative view of the economy. And quite candidly, if you're not doing something that aligns with where Canadians are at on the economy, your environmental plan just isn't going to fly.
Darryl, I don't want to let media off the hook here either. There have been a lot of press conferences with the Premier lately. Almost all of them are about tariffs or early election calls. I can't recall in the last, 10 press conferences, any questions about climate change. Are we failing?
Well, the media can read a poll and so can the Premier. And what's happening right now is not unique in Canada. I mean, the war in Ukraine has created a completely different conversation about the environment in Europe. The rise of the right, the populist right in Europe, has created a real pushback against green coalitions and progressive coalitions, even in the European Commission itself. We've just seen what's happened in the United States. It's not number one on the dance card now, even if what we just saw in California happened. What tends to happen these days is people's views of climate tend to track what happens in the news, particularly related to weather. So an event happens, takes place, goes away, and concern tends to drop down. And the problem these days is that people know that there's been a fairly, I would say, aggressive conversation about this over the space of the last 5 or 6 years, and nothing really seems to be getting any better in terms of the climate. These things still keep happening. So there's also a bit of a learned helplessness around this, I would say, as well. And when you get policies, when you have that kind of a perspective, it kind of just becomes a talking point rather than actually, you know, a statement about allegiance as opposed to actually anything that has any policy implications. I mean, the Liberal leadership contest is a great example. Can they run fast enough away from the carbon tax?
They're all doing it.
They're all doing it.
Yeah. Let me take you back not even 2 decades. You'll remember Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. It won an Oscar. It put this issue front and center for so many people that hadn't thought about it before. But then the financial crisis happens, and climate change is barely mentioned at all in subsequent presidential debates. Stéphane Dion ran on the green shift for the Liberals. It fell flat. He lost that election badly. Does our interest in saving this planet depend on how well we are doing economically in the moment?
So I'm going to make the argument that those two things go together. You know, we've had this long-standing kind of bifurcation between jobs and the environment, economy and the environment, and it's pretty clear that that's not true. I mean, there was a report released by the International Accounting Coalition that said basically we can expect possibly up to a 50% reduction in global GDP by 2070 because of climate change, right? There's been similar predictions about the drop in Canadian GDP, not obviously that large, but
here's World Economic Forum here.
Yeah.
$1.7 trillion to $3.1 trillion by the year 2050. That's what it could cost.
Right. So that's a huge number, and that's not, you know, that is about climate change and the economy in the same sentence, in the same breath. So I don't think that we need to separate these two out and say, oh, well, we can't deal with climate change until we deal with the economy. Those things are one and the same, and it's time for all of the parties to get on board with if we're going to have a climate plan, we need an economic plan, and if we're going to have an economic plan, it's going to be a climate plan.
Monty, that argument has been made by environmentalists for a long time, for 20 years now, and it does not appear to be convincing the Canadian public. They still seem to think there's a choice between the environment and having a good economy. What's the problem?
Just some context here. In the last decade, according to the Business Council of BC, Canadian economy has grown, real GDP has grown less than 1%. So that's the here and now, and that to some degree reflects the outright attack on regions of the country by the Liberal government with respect to their climate policy. We've driven away foreign direct investment. We're hurting people's paychecks. We're hurting their ability to get jobs. So there does need to be a plan that incorporates the current situation of the economy, which is that, you know, Canada does produce a lot of oil and gas. Big swaths of the economy are dependent on it, our standard of living. It can't be about something that we're promised in terms of jobs 20 or 30 years down the road. It needs to be something that aligns with where the Canadian economy is right now. And I think if you have a solution to climate change or progress on climate change that aligns with that current situation we have with the Canadian economy, you're going to have much better chance of getting buy-in. But you certainly face all kinds of skepticism, I think, when you say that down the road there'll be renewable jobs, there'll be all these green jobs, but no real evidence.
Jessica, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think, first of all, I think it's very easy to make broad statements about how environmental regulation hurts the economy, but we know that climate change hurts the economy, right? So last year, summer 2024, cost us $7 billion because of the fires and other various climate disasters. And there's also this kind of belief that oil and gas, if we regulate oil and gas, we're going to lose all these jobs. Well, most of the statistics suggest that, it's about 3.5% of Canadian jobs are in the oil and gas industry, either directly or indirectly. But if you look at healthcare and the care economy, so healthcare and education, that's looking at 12% of GDP and about 20% of Canadian jobs. So again, I think we need to be really specific about what we mean when we say this is going to hurt the economy, because it looks like there are a lot of other sources of GDP growth and economic growth that are not reliant on the oil and gas industry.
Let me circle back something that you said just a few moments ago, Daryl, because this is so interesting. It was 10 years ago that Justin Trudeau went from third to first in one election, and part of his platform was a carbon tax, and he brought it in, and there you go. And now the Liberals are having a race to replace him, and all of the candidates are running away from that policy as quickly as they can. Provincially, too, the Ontario Liberal leader says won't be a part of her platform either. What went wrong?
Well, first of all, people didn't perceive that it was actually working, that we're still having all of these carbon-related events, and we're being told by, everybody who's out there that things are just going to keep getting worse, but our bill for paying for it just keeps going up, and people don't feel that it's having an effect. The second thing, it was incredibly complicated. That you would pay out money and then you would get it back. I mean, what is
sense?
It doesn't make sense. And also, just because Justin Trudeau got elected didn't mean that everything in his platform was popular. The carbon tax was never popular. The best we ever got on it was around 50-50. So it was an unpopular policy that was tolerable at a time in which the economy was doing better. Not a popular policy in terms of effect. It hasn't really changed anything for the better. It's confusing as far as the public is concerned. And they really want to hold on to those dollars now because they feel that their own economic security is imperiled. So, the market tells you eventually, Steve, and the fact that the people who are the architects of this are running as fast as they can away from it tells you about what a political liability it is.
Let me pick up on the notion of the market with Monty, because carbon pricing is supposed to be a signal to the market that you can pay less if you are environmentally more sensible. And they've taken that approach as opposed to sort of top-down government-enforced regulation as the way to go. In which case, why don't more conservatives support a carbon tax, since it seems to be a market-based solution?
Well, I think there's a couple of answers to that. One is, as Daryl said, it is really complicated. It doesn't seem to make sense. It sounds like a shell game, taking money from consumers, sending it back to them, but then they can spend it on driving if they want. It doesn't really make sense to a lot of people, so they are naturally skeptical about government to begin with, and then you add that complication in, and it really gets pretty ugly. The second point is that there seems to be a lot of more direct ways to address climate. For instance, EVs are probably something that really, that come to some degree from the private sector innovation that is actually generating real reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. That's just one example. Nukes would be another one. The widespread use of nuclear energy that responds to some degree from private sector players who want to reduce their emissions overall, in some cases because it's just good business. That's another good example of something that's practical and that would have an immediate effect on greenhouse gases.
Why do you think, Jessica, the carbon tax has become such a, I don't know how it works in practice, but certainly politically it's become a turkey?
Yes, absolutely. And if you had played more of the clip from 5 years ago, I would have said the same thing. So I've always said that it's not a good policy, right? People don't want to pay more now for a potential benefit later. It's just, they're upfront concentrated costs, and they're not doing a whole lot to bend the curve on emissions. It's just bad politics.
Does it make sense on the face of it, though, that if there is certain behavior you don't like, i.e. polluting, you tax it, and theoretically, if you want to avoid paying tax, you'll get less pollution? I mean, that makes sense on the face of it, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. There are a lot of things that make sense, in theory, but in practice don't work out so well. And actually what works a lot better in practice is the carbon tax on large emitters. And that's really what's doing the lion's share of changing behavior. Because if you talk to, individuals, they may have a lot less flexibility in how much they can actually how much fossil fuels they can actually cut out of their quote unquote carbon budget. But if you talk to an electricity producer or an industrial emitter, they have a lot more flexibility. And that's actually those carbon taxes, which is called the output-based pricing system.
That's a good name.
Yeah, it's terrible. Actually do a lot more to reduce emissions. And that's really, going to the source of where pollution is coming from.
But Monty, if we're trying to figure out why this became such a stink bomb politically, have conservatives opposed this, not because they actually dislike the specifics of it so much, but basically just because the liberals brought it in?
No, I think there's political capital that you spend anytime you bring forward an initiative like this, and you can only bring forward one or two of these that are complicated and hope for any kind of buy-in. So I think it is a bit of a calculation. It's like, if we're going to spend our capital on getting Canadians to buy into a particular approach to climate, it better be effective and it better work. It better be something that people can understand. And I really don't think, this ever met that litmus test. It was always something that just seemed a little too indirect to be effective with voters. So I think that's the challenge. In terms of the industrial carbon tax, you've got sort of widespread support for that amongst the premiers, including Premier Smith, Premier Ford, et cetera. It does seem to respond very well to the threat of losing investment into the U.S. And it doesn't really impact Canadians day to day very directly. So, I just see that as being something that probably any leader is going to want to hold on to.
Daryl, have you done polling which would point us towards an approach that could garner public support if a future government were to take that approach?
Yeah, the problem on anything to do with the environment is that you can get people around the world and in Canada to say the following on a survey, and you do not get them. This is what they say. The first thing they say is, I believe that this is important. Overwhelming support. I believe that this is caused by human activity. Overwhelming support. I believe that somebody needs to do something about it. Overwhelming support. Okay, here's the things that you can do about it. No way.
As long as somebody else does it, they're okay.
As long as somebody else does it, that's the situation. So the politics of this one in Canada are, we discussed this on this show before, the big shift, right? Yeah. Okay, so who does a carbon tax really hurt in the view of voters? Western Canada and car commuting suburbanites in places like Toronto. How do you win elections if you're a conservative in this country?
Well, you need
appeal to Western Canadians
yes.
and car commuting suburbanites outside of the city of Toronto. Who hates the carbon tax? Those people. So that's why politically it's a valid approach for the Conservatives.
I do want to ask you, Monty, because one of the things that Pierre Poilievre has said is technology is going to figure us a way out of all of this. And, okay, maybe it will, but is that simply his way of punting the issue down the road?
No. You see examples of it all the time, even on things like renewables. We've come so far on things like solar and wind, where now when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, renewables and the innovations in renewables have caused our energy prices to come to as low as you could possibly get them, frankly. So, that's an example of technology. That's an example of innovation. You're seeing it all throughout the renewable sector, in nuclear and so many other areas. Carbon capture and storage is another example. These things will all make a difference. And that's what Canadians want, I think, when their governments invest in addressing climate change. They want to be able to point to something that actually has made a difference, and technology is definitely something that fits the bill.
Jessica, you think technology can get us there?
Well, first of all, there are different kinds of technologies, right? CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, is not a proven technology at scale. It doesn't solve the problem of combusting fossil fuels, which is the thing that we need to stop if we're going to solve the climate crisis. So I think we need to separate these out. The other thing I would say is that, technology is great, but it doesn't just implement itself, right? It requires policy and government intervention to make sure that those things can get scaled up, that there is an infrastructure to support them, and that has both legal and economic implications. So we can't just say, I mean, it would be lovely that if you build it, they will come, but it doesn't work that way. So we need to have active government policies that are both reducing the supply of fossil fuels and enhancing the demand and deployment of renewables.
Given that his polling shows that it's not a top 10 issue anymore, what did we say? Number 9.
Yeah, depending on where you go. Yeah.
Number 9. And most election campaigns don't deal with issues that rank number 9 on the public's list of concerns. 2 elections and a leadership convention coming up in the next few months. How do you get this issue on that radar screen?
Well, again, I think you don't talk about it as a climate issue. I think you talk about it as an affordability issue. I think you talk about it as, we know that there's a healthcare crisis. We need to create more funding and more jobs in the health sector, which will help us, redirect our economy towards lower carbon jobs. I think we do things like invest in building retrofitting. So buildings are 20% of our emissions in Canada. And what if we had government programs that would pay for homeowners to insulate their homes, get them off of gas, install heat pumps, these kinds of things, right? These are things that will, and reduce their energy prices, obviously, over time. These are the kinds of affordability issues that I think would appeal to people that aren't explicitly climate, but again, climate and economy are two inextricably linked issues right now.
A couple of minutes to go, Daryl. How brave or foolish do you have to be as a political party leader to do what she just said in the upcoming election campaigns?
In this current environment?
Yeah.
Pretty foolish.
So it's not the way to go.
No, and it's not that it's not right. Not that it's not right. It's no. In this current environment, if you're banging on about that stuff, talking about those things, in this current political environment, you'll be Elizabeth May. And, the party of one. This next election is going to pivot on the question, and it's going to be rising very, very rapidly about how Canada deals with its relationship with the United States.
So, Monty, if you care about the environment and you want politicians to sort of, use whatever language will work to get people to care about this, do we just have to take a siesta for the next 6 months because we know that it's a fruitless venture in the upcoming election campaigns? Is that the case?
No, I don't think so. I think Canadians want to support especially things like nature and conservation. They also want to ensure that, their forests aren't burning down in the summers. So to the degree that governments can come up with a solid plan to address those kinds of things, I think they'll win support. I actually agree with Jessica when it comes to a program like retrofitting buildings. I think that's a practical thing that helps with affordability. So I think that's correct. But they do need to be careful. Any leader right now who doesn't overtly address affordability, inflation, things like that, is going to be in real trouble. That's where the emphasis needs to be. And to the degree that you can make environmental approaches on the environment about affordability, good on you. I think that's a good way to win some support.
Jessica, let me give you the last 30 seconds to talk about how depressed you are, that the environment is not going to, we're probably not going to talk much about it at all in the next 2 elections and leadership convention.
I'm ever the optimist. I think there are a lot of ways that the Liberals and the NDP and the Greens can turn this around. Canadians we are in an increasingly unequal society. Canadians are very worried about affordability. They're very worried about fairness. So I think this is an opportunity for those parties to say, look, we need to go back to the original capital gains proposal from the Liberals. We need to make sure that the wealthy are paying their fair share. We need to stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industry to the tune of $18 billion a year. And I think these are things that will both help the climate and will appeal to voters. So I am optimistic.
Mr. Director, could I get a 3-shot, please, so I can thank all of our guests? Jessica Green from the U of T, Daryl Bricker from Ipsos Public Affairs, Monty Solberg, the former MP, now New West Public Affairs, for joining us here on TVO Tonight. Many thanks, you three.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's the economy, stupid, the Democratic strategist James Carville famously said. Well, to understand the state of our politics today and Donald Trump's second term, our guest tonight might describe it this way. It's the discontent, stupid. We welcome back Michael Sandel. He is a professor of political philosophy at Harvard, author of a new edition of Democracy's Discontent, and co-author of the most recent Equality, What It Means and Why It Matters. And he joins us now from Brookline, Massachusetts, just west of Boston, the hub of the universe. Professor Sandel, always great to have you on our program. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. It's good to be back with you, Steve.
Thank you. We are 1 week into Trump's second term. This is during a time in which almost every incumbent democratic, small d democratic government in the world either lost or certainly saw its vote share reduced. How would you characterize this moment in our collective political history?
A moment of danger for democracy, and also a moment when the center left seems exhausted politically, but also ideologically, in need of rethinking its mission and purpose. Part of what enabled Donald Trump to win a second term in the White House is that the Democratic Party, I think, had lost its energy, its sense of mission and purpose, and in particular, it's alienated working people, the working class voters who once constituted the primary base of their support.
I find that an interesting response in as much as I watched the election campaign for president as carefully as anybody, I guess. Yeah. And, you know, weren't we told Kamala Harris had returned joy to politics in the country? There's certainly a lot of enthusiasm at all of her rallies. It didn't look like the Democratic Party was out of touch. It looked actually like after Biden left and Harris came in, they'd recaptured a bit of mojo. So why are you saying what you're saying?
Well, it's true. She did energize the campaign after Biden's disastrous debate performance revealed the advancing age and its infirmities. But that energy proved short-lived because while it was a morale booster for a time, it wasn't based on any fundamental rethinking of what the Democratic Party had to offer, especially the working class voters who had faced nearly 5 decades of wage stagnation and a sense that elites were looking down on them. The Democrats, Steve, haven't figured out a way to speak to the sense of grievance, the discontent with democracy. I dare say this is true of center-left parties in many democracies around the world. The sense of discontent, even the anger and resentment that Trump is able to exploit, Democrats and center-left parties need to figure out what's the source of it and how to speak to it.
We well remember in 2016, Donald Trump winning his first term, and a lot of people at the time said, well, this is just a one-off. It's a fluke. He didn't win the popular vote. It's just the way the Electoral College worked out that he ended up winning. Well, clearly that was not the case because he's back. So do you think we have entered what I guess historians will look back at as a new era in politics?
Yes. And what the name of that new era will be remains to be seen. At the moment, the name of it is the era of Donald Trump, because it turns out, just as you say, his 2016 election turned out not to be a fluke. Joe Biden presented himself, and many considered him to be kind of restoration of a sane, decent, mainstream politics. But in retrospect, I think the Biden years may be viewed as an interregnum in the age of Trump. Now, whether that is the description that historians will apply to this moment depends a lot on what the Democratic Party is able to do in opposition, rethinking its offer to the public, rethinking its economic project, but also how to speak to the anger, the worries, the anxieties of the age.
I am happy to tell our viewers and listeners how ahead of the curve you were on these observations. And to do so, we're going to go back almost 30 years. I want to do a quote from the first edition of your Democracy's Discontents. You wrote this in 1996. Here we go. To the extent that contemporary politics puts sovereign states and sovereign selves in question, it is likely to provoke reactions from those who would banish ambiguity, shore up borders, harden the distinction between insiders and outsiders, and promise a politics to, quote, take back our culture and take back our country, to, quote, restore our sovereignty with a vengeance. Well, for a lot of people, 1996 was a time of great optimism. The Cold War was over. Democratic capitalism had pretty much shown that it had prevailed. Frank Fukuyama told us it was the end of history, admittedly with a question mark at the end, but still you get the idea. You were not quite so optimistic even 3 decades ago. How come?
Well, first, thanks for recalling that passage, Steve. Beneath the peace and prosperity of the 1990s, and amidst the hubris that our version of democratic capitalism had won the day, the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union had given way. Beneath that optimism, and I would say also hubris, were rumbling sources of discontent, having to do partly with the sense that people were less and less in control of the forces that governed their lives, a growing sense of disempowerment, a worry about the project of self-government. That was one source of worry. The other was a sense that the moral fabric of community, from family to neighborhood to nation, was unraveling around us. So a sense of disempowerment, that one's voice didn't matter, that we didn't have a meaningful say in shaping the forces that governed our lives, and the loss of community. These were palpable, if then inchoate, sources of discontent with democracy. And now we awaken to a world in which those inchoate sources of discontent have hardened into anger and resentment, having in large part to do, I think, with the way the market-driven or neoliberal version of globalization was played out, and the growing inequalities it created, and the deepening divide between winners and losers over recent decades. The mainstream parties, and especially the Democratic Party in the U.S., and I would say mainstream center-left parties in many democracies, were actually among the most enthusiastic supporters of that version of globalization and deregulation. And then we had the financial crash, and then we had the bank bailout, and that's what hardened. That's what hardened the anger, I think. And Democrats and center-left parties haven't figured out how to address that anger. Donald Trump has, even if the solutions he proposes won't remedy that underlying inequality and sense that people are being looked down upon by elites.
Well, Senator Bernie Sanders, who's from a state right next door to your own, his explanation for why the Democrats have been losing goes like this, quote, "It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them." Do you agree with Senator Sanders?
I think he's right about that. I think that the Democratic Party, by embracing, and this goes back to the 1990s. I mean, it began the market triumphalist faith as a governing philosophy began with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who argued explicitly that government is the problem and markets are the solution. But even after they were succeeded on the political scene by center-left parties, Bill Clinton in the United States and the New Democrats, Tony Blair in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, what these center-left successors to the Reagan era did was they softened the harsh edges of a pure laissez-faire system, but they never challenged the fundamental premise of the market faith, the idea that market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good. And as a result, we never really had a debate about the role and reach of markets. Instead, we had free trade agreements. We insisted on the free flow of capital across national borders, all in the name of globalization. It was a very particular version of globalization. And yet it was presented as inevitable, as a force of nature. And so people felt not only that inequality was deepening, but that their voices didn't matter. They weren't really being consulted. We weren't debating whether this new set of economic arrangements and the deregulation of the financial industry, whether that really served the public good. And so this is why I think the Democratic Party has been the primary target of the populist backlash against these arrangements.
I suspect you could add Canada's Prime Minister of the day, Jean Chrétien, to that list of center-left first ministers, presidents, and so on, because he signed the North American Free Trade Agreement with Bill Clinton. And I guess my question is, if we could go back in time, would your recommendation to them have been, let's not do these free trade agreements. Let's stop globalization, because 30 years from now, you have no idea what headache you've got waiting for you.
Well, it depends what you mean by globalization. If you mean developing economic and political and social relationships among countries, that's a good thing. Generally speaking, trade is a good thing. But what those free trade agreements of the neoliberal era were mainly about were not reducing tariffs, which were already pretty low by that time. They were mainly about enforcing property rights, intellectual property rights regimes, so that Disney could continue to patent Mickey Mouse long into the future, pharmaceutical patents that would be extended to prevent the generic manufacture of drugs. There were all kinds of things built into those free trade agreements. So the mistake was the kind of hyper-globalization that we had that essentially discredited national community and disempowered nation states, which are the primary vehicle for enabling citizens to make their voices heard. And so there was an insistence on free capital flows unregulated across borders. This led to all kinds of financial instability. The system did produce economic growth. That much of the promise it did achieve. Problem is, almost all of the growth of that period went to the top 10% or 20%. The bottom half, in the United States at least, experienced in real terms stagnant wages for nearly 5 decades. So the gains were not fairly distributed. And then when the deregulation led to the financial crisis, and then when the same political actors bailed out Wall Street and left ordinary homeowners to fend for themselves, it's no surprise that ordinary citizens were angry.
You will well remember during the Biden administration, there was a train derailment in a small place called East Palestine, Ohio. And, there was a great deal of controversy about how actively or not the federal government responded to the disaster that was happening there. It was a red state. It was the kinds of people who were affected are the kinds of people you are talking about right now. And it's, I guess the issue I want to raise here is an interview that Joe Rogan did with now Vice President J.D. Vance, which really indicates how changed the Republican Party of our youth is nowadays. Here's the clip, Vance and Rogan, and we'll come back and chat on the other side. Sheldon, roll it if you would.
So I talked about this train disaster in East Palestine, and the railroad companies hate me because I kind of went on a crusade against them afterwards. And what I realized is, think of all the costs of that disaster. Think of the healthcare costs, the welfare costs from people who lost their jobs, the declining home values in that community, just all of the costs absorbed by that community. And the railroads are paying slap-on-the-hand fines. And it sort of occurred to me that the reason they're not more serious about these train disasters is because they're privatizing the rewards. But when a major train disaster happens, who picks up the tab? It's the local residents and it's the American taxpayer. And that's something that fundamentally has to change.
Now, that's a statement that could have come out of Bernie Sanders' mouth. And I'm wondering, what does it say about politics today that the Republican vice president of the United States and one of the more left-wing senators in your country seem to be in complete alignment on that kind of thing?
Well, it's an interesting observation, Steve. And listening to J.D. Vance in that clip, one could almost believe that he's a populist. Now, what was happened, and what you're highlighting, is that there are strands of populism, that there is a right-wing version of populism and a left-wing version of populism. And the predominant one since 2016 in the United States has been the right-wing version of populism, which, as historically, is bound up with, well, it's an uneasy amalgam of railing against elites, unaccountable corporate power, and it's historically been mixed up with nativism, racism, and anti-Semitism. This is not a new feature of right-wing populism. It goes all the way back to the early days of populism in the American second half of the 19th century. And there has also been a left populism. Bernie Sanders represents it now, which is concerned also with unaccountable, concentrated power in big corporations, the railroads in this example. I would extend it to the tech companies today, but that it does not traffic in the kind of nativism and xenophobia and racism that some of Trump's political appeals reach for. So this connection to populism does represent a departure for J.D. Vance and that wing of the MAGA movement, a departure from the traditional mainstream country club republicanism, which was mainly in support of big business. So the real open question here for the MAGA movement is whether it will develop this strand of populist critique of concentrated economic power, or whether it will simply use populist rhetoric at election time, but govern in a kind of plutocratic populist way, which is what Trump did in his first term. His only real achievement was a massive tax cut that went mainly to the wealthy and to big corporations. So that's plutocratic populism. And the inaugural tableau, did you see?
Yes.
Up seated behind him, right among his family, no less, were the titans of big tech, from Elon Musk to Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos. This is not a populist tableau. These are the big tech companies and moguls that real populists want to challenge and hold to democratic account. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, the tension between these two strands within the MAGA movement.
Indeed. There looked like there were more billionaires per square inch at that inauguration than at anyone I've ever seen before. Sometimes little incidents or little stories can tell a very big story. And you had such an example take part in your life, and I'd love you to finish the story about while you're on vacation in Florida and you get onto an elevator and you get into a very short conversation with a woman from Iowa, which is good old middle America, red state, Donald Trump territory. Pick up the story from there if you would.
She asked me, where are you from? I said Boston. And she said, well, I'm from Iowa. And we can read in Iowa. I didn't know where that came from. I hadn't said I'm from Harvard. I hadn't said I'm a professor. All I said was Boston. And then as she got out of the elevator, over her shoulder, she said, we don't much like people on the coasts. And this takes us back, Steve, to the conversation we were having about the politics of identity. And this was not about woke identity. This was about the sense that many people have, many working people, many people who live in rural areas or in the middle of the country, that coastal elites, credentialed elites, well-educated elites look down on them. And this is what I've called the tyranny of merit, the way in which the sense among many of the winners of globalization have not been content only with the winnings, but also want to claim that their winnings are their due, that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit. And so it's interesting that she said, we can read in Iowa, which shows that the resentment against elites is not against elites who are in business or wealthy, as Trump is wealthy. It's resentment against credentialed elites, against meritocratic elites, who many people feel look down on them. And so one way of summing it up is that the market-driven version of hyperglobalization deepened the divide between rich and poor. But the meritocratic hubris of the successful during that same period is what created the divide between winners and losers. That's the divide that's toxic to our politics, that polarizes us. And that recognition, I think, should be the starting point for a bold project of democratic renewal that I hope will lead to a new definition, a more energized definition of what progressive politics can be.
That story is so fabulous because, of course, she would not know that you feel the exact same way about this issue as she does. And do you wish that you'd had an extra moment with her to say, hey, look, lady, I feel your pain. In fact, I've written books about this. I'm with you. You didn't get a chance to say that, I guess.
Well, I didn't think quickly enough, but if I had, Steve, I would have said, I don't doubt that you can read in Iowa. And I'd like to give you something to read, my book, The Tyranny of Marriage. I see where you're coming from.
Exactly right. Well, okay, let's finish up on this then. Clearly, there is a sense in red state America particularly that coastal elites are looking down their noses at people, and they feel that they have been the big losers since globalization of the last 30 years. I'd like your prescription on how we can even begin to kind of restore a relationship where red state and blue state can talk to each other again, where people who feel looked down upon can reclaim their dignity, and Americans can, stop these culture, if not stop, at least reduce the culture wars. How do we do that?
Well, I think we need to begin by shifting the political rhetoric, but also the political project away from saying the solution to inequality and wage stagnation is for you to improve yourself if you're struggling by going and getting a college degree. About 2/3 of Americans do not have four-year degrees, so it's folly to create an economy that makes a necessary condition of dignified work and a decent life a four-year degree that most people don't have. So I would shift the terms of political argument toward what does it mean to honor and renew the dignity of work, to make life better, and to honor and recognize everyone who contributes to the common good through the work they do, the families they raise, the communities they serve, whether or not they have prestigious credentials. That would be one starting point. I think we also have to remake civil society. But one of the most corrosive effects of the deepening inequalities has been that we increasingly live separate lives, a kind of class segregation almost that tracks education to some degree. Democracy does not require perfect equality, but what it does require is that people from different walks of life, different class backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, encounter one another in the ordinary course of the day. Because this is how we learn to negotiate and to abide our differences. And this is how we come to care for the common good. And so we need to rebuild those class mixing institutions, the public places and common spaces that gather us together, even inadvertently, well, to speak of our shared love of baseball, in a stadium, in a sports stadium, or in a library, or in public transit, or in a public park where our kids go to play, rather than opting out, seceding from public places by going to the private health club. So rebuilding the civic infrastructure for a shared democratic mode of life, Steve, I think is an on-the-ground concrete step that could begin to heal the divide and enable us, from time to time at least, to talk to one another.
That is so wise. And you had you not said it, I was going to say that if you look at any home movies from Fenway Park from 50 years ago, the rich and the poor were sitting together in the stands. And nowadays, you know, the rich are up in their private boxes and the lower income people aren't going to the games anymore at all, because even to sit in the outfield is $75, which is certainly well beyond the ability of most. Yeah, you're so right. We got to figure that out. Michael Sandel, we always appreciate the fact that you come on this program and share your wisdom with us. Thank you for taking our calls. And until next time, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Steve. Really appreciate it.
And that is the agenda for Monday, January 27th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, we look at how provinces are planning to offset President Trump's tariff threat. Hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.